Welcome to our series on St. Louis de Montfort's True Devotion to Mary, as adapted by Eddie Doherty. We're journeying through this book with Father Hugh, Gillespie, a de Montfort father, and Father Bernard Geiger, Franciscan. And we're on chapter 6 now, the false devotions. Father, you said there are 7 false devotions. You want to take one at a time?
I think so. And it's curious that Montfort puts this chapter now at this point, but methodologically what he's doing makes a lot of sense. He's gone at great pains to establish the fact that we need a devotion to Mary. And so he concludes the last chapter by saying, now we have to find the right one. And that's a really important decision to make. So in order to know the right one, it's helpful to know which roads not to go down. So that's what he's going to do in this chapter. He's going to say there are 7 forms of false devotion. And again, the French is a little more clear in the first sentence here, just to kind of put the nuance out, which one might easily mistake for true devotion. So he's not interested in things that are obviously wrong. But he's saying that these are paths that we could easily and naturally find ourselves moving down if we're not careful. Lurking in the background here is Montfort's great fondness for the wisdom literature, the scriptures. And 2 of the great figures in that literature are the women, wisdom and folly. And a lot is done in the Old Testament wisdom books of the contrast between the 2 with how easily one can mistake foolishness for wisdom. She acts like her on some levels, she moves like her, she does some of the same things, and you only know the difference sometimes when it's too late, when she brings you to a bad end. And so the truly wise person is the one who is able to choose between these 2 and to recognize wisdom and folly. And Montfort is doing the same thing here. He's like, when you recognize which things we're not looking for, it narrows the field and it's easier to find what we are looking for.
All right. So now the first one now.
Yes. But the next thing he does, though, and this is important, this paragraph, the ordinary counterfeiter seldom troubles to imitate base coins. It is not profitable. He wants something that can pass for gold or silver. The devil seldom bothers about spurious devotions. He does not concentrate all the power of evil on counterfeiting the gold and silver coin. He does concentrate all the power of evil on counterfeiting the gold and silver coins of devotion to Jesus and Mary.
Now he knows this is where the power is, so he's going to...
And this is an important insight and a real caution for everybody at this point. Because Montfort recognizes that the great genius of the unholy is to be able to masquerade itself with the holy. In fact, one of the themes that one finds in spiritual literature is, if you want to find the unholy, find the holy, and you'll find the unholy standing next to it and trying to look like it. And, Montfort is signed in this note here as a caution for us, too, to recognize our motivations might be good, but we want to be careful that we don't let something that's wrong root itself in us as we move forward.
That's because the devil will focus on his true devotion. I think people would faint if they saw the spiritual warfare around it, but we have nothing to fear. We're on Mary's side.
Right. But in fact, Montfort in the 6th false devotion is going to come back to that point of the masquerade. But the first one, the first points 1 and 2, we've already seen as we've read through the book. We stopped a couple times and noted where Montfort was raising some objections and answering them. Once fairly gently, a second time in fairly vigorous and strong language. Now he comes back to these same 2 points, and they're the first 2 false devotions for him. Now again, note, false devotions. In other words, somebody who holds these first 2, mistakenly believes he's on the right track. And Montfort's saying, you've bought into an error. And so the first, he says, are the critical devotees. And he says, these are usually proud scholars and people of independent and self-satisfied minds. And they, on the one hand, will acknowledge a certain value to devotion of Mary, but they'll object to almost every form in which it finds expression. Why do you say the rosary? Why the scapular? Why the processions? Why praying in front of a statue? In the sense that if a person can't explain or doesn't understand it, it must not be genuine. It's merely exterior. Now, you note on the one hand, there's a desire to be authentic. On the other hand, there's a great fear of almost any external manifestation.
Yes.
And Montfort says, that's the problem. That's the problem. Everything is reduced to, if I can't rationalize it or explain it,
Yes.
it can't be any good.
Yes.
And Montfort says, the spiritual life is more about what we can simply grasp and rationalize and easily fit into our cognitive structures. There is an emotive dimension to it. There is an experiential dimension to it. And that's just as real and just as important. And there is sometimes the reality that our external manifestations are going to be right, but we're not always going to be able to neatly summarize them or explain them. And, if we go down this road, those who don't have the benefit of a university education, those who don't have the benefit of a bookshelf jammed with theological resources, those who don't have the benefit of even purchasing videos like these and watching them, who simply have the basic tools that they've been given, they're shut out of a genuine devotion.
Yes.
And Montfort says that's wrong. That is very, very wrong. And so let's be careful here. And so he's saying this kind of intellectual criticism, this kind of desire to neatly fit and neatly summarize and completely master everything, let's be careful with that.
There's a mystery here.
Right, right. But you notice he spends a lot of time talking about it. This and the first two, he spends a lot of time talking about it because this critical devotee is also the kind of person who would pick up the book and read it. So Montfort wants to talk to this person. Now, if you're thinking, he's saying, I want to engage you.
Right.
Now, the next is the scrupulous devotee. And we've already seen this one, too. This is the one who's afraid about taking honor away from Jesus by honoring Mary.
Yes.
If I keep talking about Mary all the time, somehow I'm not talking enough about Jesus. If I'm always saying my rosary or if I'm adorning the Mary altar, I'm not spending enough time focusing on Jesus. If I'm praying to Mary, I'm not spending enough time with the Lord. And so Montfort's saying, this person's heart is in the right place. Really, this is understandable. Your heart wants to honor Jesus, but you're afraid to honor Mary because you think somehow that detracts from the Son.
That's where our Protestant brethren are. Yes.
Many times, yes. And so again, he spends quite a bit of time talking about this, and he's fairly sympathetic because he recognizes there's a real and a good desire to honor Jesus. That's true, that's genuine. What's false is the understanding of Mary, that somehow the mother diminishes the Son.
And that Jesus is in competition with Mary.
Right, very good, yes, yes. And yeah, as if somehow there's a race to build a better altar to Mary, which would take away the honor of Jesus. Now, Montfort also recognizes there are certain exaggerated expressions of Marian piety which are going to give people that impression.
Right.
And that's a problem, too. He's going to talk about that as we move further. But he wants to put these two on the table first.
Okay.
Now, he's going to come to devotions that we're going to be more familiar with in a Catholic context and errors. So the third one now is the exterior devotee. Now, you notice, why are the first two devotees critical of devotion to Mary? Because of this one.
Okay.
It's merely exterior. It has no substance and no depth. That's what the critical devotee is going to say. So Montfort acknowledges that. He's going to say, that guy's right.
Yeah.
And our Protestant brothers and sisters at times are very, very correct. There are forms of devotion to Mary that are exactly what they're saying.
Yes.
And so he says, this is the one that has no interior spirit. This is the person who races through the rosary, and it says the rosary every day in about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
This is the person who goes to all the processions, joins all the confraternities, knows and sings all the songs, but it doesn't penetrate, and loves the spontaneous pious gesture and the great traditional customs without changing his or her life.
Yes.
Without reforming himself or herself, without really drawing closer to Jesus. It's all superficial. This is the person who laments when the traditional gesture isn't there,
Yes.
but who never let the traditional gesture penetrate. And so having talked about the first two, Montfort now And it's interesting how open he is. He now acknowledges their objections and says, we don't want that either.
Right.
We don't want a superficial or an external devotion. We want one where if I'm doing these practices every day, they penetrate my heart. Where if I'm marching in procession, where if I'm carrying a statue, where if I'm wearing my scapular, there's a spiritual substance within me that this is expressing and encouraging. And this is not just something I do because it feels nice or it looks good.
Right.
Now the fourth is related. He calls this the presumptuous devotee. And this, like the exterior devotee, is a person who hasn't reformed his life, but for a different reason. The presumptuous devotee is a sinner who's given himself over to his or her sinfulness and has made his peace with living in his vices because he's conscious of the promises Mary made to her faithful.
Yeah, he's presuming she's going to...
Exactly. This person relies on the promise that Mary comes to those who've honored her even once and will give them the grace of the opportunity of confession and the deathbed conversion.
Yeah.
And Montfort says, this person is content to skate and do absolutely nothing. This is the wrong kind of trust in Mary.
Right.
This is a misplaced and a misguided trust. This is the person who reads about an apparition or a promise of the Virgin, who takes it and says, okay.
Yeah, I don't have to worry about it.
I've said this prayer a few times. I'm good to go. And in the end, she's going to make sure I have that last opportunity.
Right.
So I can continue to enjoy all my sins.
Exactly. And Montfort says, well, this is absolutely no devotion at all.
Well, St. Augustine there.
Right. And you know, the other problem with this is that notion that comes in and say, well, God redeemed us to forgive us and to save us, and he doesn't want to condemn us. And Montfort would say with the church, you know, that's exactly true. God does not want to condemn us. But if we persistently cling
to the devil,
to evil, if we consistently choose to say, my prayer is let me remain in the guilt I've acquired, in the end, that prayer will be answered. And we have no right to presume that it's going to be otherwise. Montfort castigates this form of devotion because it's dangerous and it's sinful. You know, you don't just take God for granted, you abuse the trust that God has given you. Now, if we're honest, there can always be this spirit of presumption in any one of us. You know, there's always that point where we too easily make our peace with our sinfulness. Now, Montfort is really talking here about the person who lives in that presumption and makes it persistent. But, you know, as we go through, one of the things we'll want to come back to at the end of this chapter is how one can look at these 7 tools as a discernment aid when we examine our conscience.
Right. That's a good point. That's true.
Now, number 5. Number 5 is a very, very common. In fact, probably it is the most common form of false devotion that one would find from people who would embrace Montfort's spirituality. It's the inconstant devotee. And this again is so common to all of us and so common everywhere. This is the person who embraces the spirituality, embraces the role of Mary with great enthusiasm out of the gate. Who, for example, reads Montfort and says, you know, the guy's right, I've got to do this. Or that person who's new to the church, recently converted in the heat of that experience of conversion, and rushes in and wants to be involved in everything. And I have to do this devotion and say this prayer, and I have to be involved in this group and that group, and throws himself or herself into that, and about 2 or 3 months later is unreliable and stops showing up and lets these things down. And then 6 months later gets his second wind and comes back in with the same amount of enthusiasm, only to a little while later be unreliable again. And this kind of inconstancy, which is so common.
Yes, it is,
whether you were old or you're young, it's very common, especially when something's new. We embrace it, we dive into it. The novelty wears off, we get a little disenchanted, we pull back. And
trials come, we forget about
Well, these are the people that basically are run by their emotions rather than commitment.
Right.
As the feeling comes and goes, so they come and go.
Right. And one of the difficult things, just even in ministry sometimes, is you work with a young person who has a real hot conversion experience. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, one doesn't want to dissipate that. One doesn't want to blunt that. Right. But one has to put the brakes on some of it, to allow this person to put roots down in that change. Yes. Because otherwise, all too often what happens is we can fall into a model of ministry and work where it's all enthusiasm. And it feels good that weekend or that week or at that retreat. And we go out feeling like changed men and women, only to hit the wall a short while later. And it becomes really important to recognize that, or the notion that one shouldn't be spiritually greedy. There's an elderly spiritual director, and when I was a student in Madison, Wisconsin, used that expression once, and I've loved it.
Spiritual greed, I never...
the sense of, I have to try this, I have to get this grace, I have to do this devotion. And to want everything now.
Right.
But to say, no, better to do a few things, as Montfort says. Better one Hail Mary, well said, than 1,000 rosaries, said quickly and inattentively. And so this becomes also the enemy of the simplicity and the humility that one really needs. Then he's very brief. He's very brief with number 6. But this, on a lot of levels, is one of the most dangerous of all the forms of false devotion. This is the hypocritical devotee. This is insidious. He's very brief here because the hypocritical devotee wouldn't even pick up his book. This is not the person who would read the book. He says, the hypocritical false devotee seeks to hide his ugliness of soul from the eyes of others by flying the banner of the Virgin Most Pure. This, now think about that a moment. This is dangerous stuff. This is one of those things where, for all the times Montfort will talk about how devotion to Mary is the mark of someone you can trust, this is the person who's going to violate that trust. And Montfort is saying, not everybody who speaks about the sweetness and the goodness of Mary is all sweetness and goodness inside. There are some of those, remember that notion, the unholy masquerades as the holy? Here it is. Here it is. This is the desire to appear holy. This is the desire to gain somebody's trust. I worked a couple years at a Marian shrine that we have in Connecticut. And there were some days where we would sit down with one another and talk afterwards and say, some of the nastiest people who come here are the ones who speak in the most sweet language of Mary. And that's not universal. I don't want to generalize, but it is a reality in the church that and people can do a lot of damage by winning somebody's trust with mixed motivations or bad motivations. And so Montfort is saying here, if you're reading the book, he's expecting you're not going to be a hypocritical devotee. But he wants you to be able to keep your eyes open so that you don't turn off your brain or your discernment, and you're careful who you trust as a spiritual director, a spiritual guide, that you make sure that this person is genuinely authentic.
And that's hard. It's very hard to find people that are really good guides. So this is why the formation is so important.
It really is, and we so easily give our trust. It's remarkable that 300 years ago, one sees this in writing. Be very careful. Be very careful with the way you trust someone, especially with your spiritual formation. Because not everybody who says this is my motivation really has that as their motivation. Then the last devotee, and he's also very brief here because this person wouldn't read the book either. And these are the interested devotees. And they only have devotion to Mary, Montfort says, because they want something or they need something. I'm sick, heal me. I need a job. Life is terrible, I'm going to go and pray. The need is met or the crisis passes, so does the devotion. And so here, this is pure self-seeking. It's not really devotion at all. If it's devotion to my own proper interest. And so, again, these last two are brief, not because they're less significant than the others, but most likely because they're the least likely candidates to actually open the book, take some time with it, and read it.
And I think we can fall into the pitfalls of Pharisees by judging others too. We have a tendency to, when you enter into spiritual life, it seems like the temptation that the devil comes in with is that spiritual hypocrisy where you're judging others. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to build communities within the parishes. And one of the biggest problems there is when you're trying to be holy, you're trying to have your kids be holy, and not all kids are angels. And you start to ostracize your family from this family that has some of these kids that aren't acting properly, instead of strategizing how to bring them around and praying for them. That's one of the biggest problems we see.
It really is, and across the church, we have, to use a word from the New Testament, peculiar forms of Pharisaism.
Yes. Yeah.
Which come in where we set ourselves up as, we easily pronounce judgments on somebody else's orthodoxy or lack of orthodoxy.
Yes, right.
And always, it's interesting how many of us want to climb up into the Pope's chair and make those pronouncements.
Right.
Or we judge one another in terms of quality of character or morality, and all the while never looking at at ourselves, and that we have no right to be doing that. And yet that's I'm glad you brought that up, because that hypocritical form also roots itself in us very easily.
Yeah, very easily.
It
seems to be the temptation of young people when they're trying to raise their kids holy, and they're doing all they can, homeschooling, doing everything they can, and some just don't make it, and they have free will, and then other families isolate, and
Right, and we lose sight of the fact that the gospel is a messy reality. And Jesus didn't come to perfect lives and perfect situations.
Right.
He came to manifestly imperfect and broken realities.
Right.
And in our desire to get everything right, oftentimes we miss that.
Yes.
We lack compassion for those same realities.
Yeah, because we had a couple. When we moved to Portugal, we had that situation where we never raised teenagers. We had a younger family, and this other couple had some teenagers, and they were just typical teenagers. Well, we didn't know that, and we just thought they were terrible, and we were isolating the family from them, and it took us a year to catch on that this was just not right. And today, those kids are very active Catholics, the ones that we thought were the devil incarnate. We're very, one's a numerary in Opus Dei, another one's supernumerary, very active in the church. So this is why we have to be so careful not to judge others as we move through it.
Right.
Well, we got 1 minute left. Excuse me, my asthma's kicking in. 1 minute left. How would you want to summarize this now?
I would say one of the practical imports for this is not just in recognizing things that we don't want to pick up, but from time to time to look at our actions against these 7 measures. Is my spiritual life largely exterior right now and lacking depth? Have I been hypocritical? Have I been too self-interested in what I've been doing? Do I have some kind of wrong scrupulosity where I don't have my spirituality well integrated?
Right.
These are also just good weather vanes for where I am spiritually at the moment.
Right. Well, it's excellent, Father. We just want to thank you for joining us. And again, St. Louis de Montfort is spirituality for our time, and it was the spirituality of John Paul. So please write us today or call us at 1-800-77-FAMILY and get involved, or visit our website at familyland.org. Thank you, and God bless you.